Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar today, where Dr. Nick Dionne-Odom will talk about 10 questions to consider when doing research with family caregivers. A couple of items before we get started are, we'd ask you to submit all questions to the Q&A feature, which is a button at the bottom of your screen. If you type in questions, we'll be able to answer those during kind of periodically throughout the webinar, and we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. If any questions come up as we're going through that are more technical in nature, if you're having trouble hearing, we'd ask that you use the chat feature, and we will try to answer all of those. And then all of our attendees are muted and videos are not turned on, so you do not need to worry about that. Our panelists today, in addition to Dr. Nick Dionne-Odom, Betty Farrell is our core leader for the PCRC Caregiver Corps, and Dr. Catherine Pollock is one of our 3 co-chairs for the PCRC. And another welcome to Naomi Gallopin, who's a new PCRC operations member. So I think we'll get started, and I'll ask Dr. Pollock to introduce our host.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks to all who are joining, and a special thanks to Nick Dionne-Odom, who is an assistant professor at the School of Nursing at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He's a co-director of caregiving and bereavement support services at UAB Center for Palliative and Supportive Care, and at the UAB Hospital, and an early career associate of PCRC's Caregiver Corps. He's also the program committee co-chair of the inaugural State of the Science Conference. I want you all to submit abstracts, please, and attend. For hospice and palliative care researchers in March 2020, co-occurring with the annual assembly. His research focuses on developing and testing early palliative care interventions for family caregivers of persons with advanced cancer and heart failure, particularly among rural dwellers and minorities. And he's currently funded by NINR, NCI, and the MPCRC. So very excited to have Nick share with us his expertise on these very important topics on family caregivers. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Catherine. Rebecca Shear, you've got the right idea. You are using the question and answer, and I love that. I think that's probably going to be the most helpful as we kind of go through this presentation. As I kind of look down the list of folks on the call, I see sort of a range of people, people who probably should be giving this webinar instead of me. But to keep it really interesting and relevant for all of you, it's going to be most helpful, I think, if people have specific comments to use the question and answer. And I have it open, I can see it on my other screen. And so I can directly address questions as they come about. And please just don't even hesitate. Even if you're heckling, that's fine too. Just throw it on up there. Rebecca asked, can you provide recommendations for caregiving measures, screening and intervention? Absolutely. And are there assessments besides basic that you'd recommend using? So I think that's a good segue to just getting right into the 10 questions that I think are helpful for any of us when we're considering doing research in family caregiving. And some of these are basic, and some of them are perhaps warrant a little bit more specific answers. So I think the first question that one always wants to ask is, why do I even want to include family caregivers in my study? What are some of the major reports and papers that I might want to know about? How do I define family caregiver? It's actually not as easy as you might think. What is my theoretical or conceptual model or framework? What outcomes am I trying to affect when I'm designing a study? What demographics should I collect? What instruments should I use? how am I going to recruit and retain caregivers in my study? I'm interested in caregiving interventions. What should I know? And I'll have to tell folks, most of my meat and potatoes research is as an intervention developer, clinical trialist. And so a lot of the stuff that I refer to is kind of from that context. But I've also done qualitative stuff. So if you are doing qualitative interviews with folks, or you're doing survey design, or you're doing big data, happy to also try to answer questions like that too. What institutes and funding announcements are there currently related to family caregiving? And I see that Karen Kell, I think you're on, which is great. There's a new PAR that just came out that I'll mention that does speak to family caregiving. And finally, how can the PCRC caregiving core help me? So as you've probably noticed, these are pretty large questions. And so, it's very much like we're gonna do some window shopping. I will take you down sort of some big ideas. And then if you all can use the question and answer block, that'll help me go into stores, if you will, to check out what's in there and maybe speak a little bit more at length. Otherwise, I'll probably just basically skim over some of these key points. So I also have to acknowledge that, there's a lot of you that do this research. I'm offering my opinion. A lot of you do this work and I haven't cited everybody. And so, a lot of this is just, caregiving research according to Nick. So please use the question and answer feature. Love different opinions. All right, so question 1. Why do I even want to include caregivers in my study? I think that's a great question to kind of pose if you're even thinking about it. And it's not too crazy here. I think there's 3 basic reasons. 1, you want to know what impact caregivers have on patients. Maybe you're a mostly patient-focused person and you're doing a study and you interact with caregivers and patients are telling you that they have a huge impact on some sort of research that you do. You may want to know what impact caregivers are having on these patient outcomes. And I'll go through quite a number of outcomes one might consider if you're looking at this sort of direction of effect. Number 2, you want to know what impact caregiving has on caregivers. So for people like me, I'm mostly interested in caregiving outcomes. So I really focus on what the experience of being in some sort of caregiving role has on the quality of life and the healthcare utilization of caregivers themselves. The 3rd reason you might want to study caregiving is you want to know what impact caregiving has on everyone and everything else. So given that they are delivering the majority of care in the home, they have a huge impact on not just patients, they have a huge impact on medical or healthcare encounters with providers. They have a huge impact on healthcare utilization, on accessing palliative care, on advanced care planning, all of these outcomes that we sort of tend to think about in palliative care. Caregiving probably has an impact on it. So those are the top 2 reasons. I did have a slide of 3 reasons that you don't want to probably study caregiving, but I took it out. And some of those reasons have to do with you just happen to have data available, or like you have a student coming through and they need a project. I would say that it really needs to be sort of focused on sort of these primary reasons should be the real driving force, because it's not easy to do caregiving research, and so it's good to be sort of motivated by the right reasons. Okay, so what are some of the major reports and papers on caregiving I should know about? So this is tough because there's a lot out there. I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of some of the things that I would encourage people to kind of orient themselves. And I think the first thing is our clinical practice guidelines for quality of palliative care. It might not be too obvious, actually. Why would we even care about family caregivers? Is it even part of our scope of practice? The answer is yes. Family caregiver assessments now referenced in numerous domains of palliative care, and it really justifies our subspecialties' involvement in direct family support. So if you're doing research and you need to directly address why this is a palliative care concern, I think it's firm foundation to stand on our clinical practice guidelines for that reason, for that justification. The second biggest report that came out in 2015, it's a behemoth 300-page National Academy of Medicine report on families caring for an aging America. There's chapters in this report on prevalence, on public health surveillance efforts of family caregiving, their roles, their impact. There's a section on their trajectory over time in different illnesses. There's a chapter on the economic impact of caregiving. There's a long section on programs at the individual, organizational, and social and policy level. They have a chapter on their interactions with the health system, and they also have a very long list of recommendations to support family caregiving, some of which have actually been taken up by the Department of Health and Human Services, where they have now formed a Family Caregiving Advisory Council. I will say that one limitation to this one, I was scrolling down the list, I'm not sure how many pediatric folks are on. There's a reason that they called it Families Caring for an Aging America, and that's because it does not include comment on pediatric family caregiving or parental family caregiving. The next big report I would probably point people to is the National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP. About every 5 years or so, I think they've done this now for the 4th or 5th time, they do these population-based surveys using random digit dialing. This most recent one in 2015 was of about 1,200 caregivers, where they estimate prevalence, they look at living situations, care recipient conditions, they look at what activities caregivers are actually doing, including medical and nursing tasks, the impact of caregiving on employment and on work, and it also does a great job of really outlining unmet needs. It's a really great sort of all-encompassing population-level resource when you're thinking about the big picture public health perspective of family caregiving. This one is, again, another nationally representative population-based survey that's done by AARP. This is, I believe, the second time they've done the Home Alone survey. This one was over 2,000 family caregivers randomly selected nationally. They really look at the preparation that folks have in the home to provide home-based care. They do a really great job in this particular publication about breaking down by generation, like Generation X, Millennials, et cetera, Y, and the different challenges they face by generation. And also, I believe parental caregiving, but I have to double check on that one. They also make 10 very broad recommendations at the institutional, community, and public policy level that might be worth citing as you're sort of justifying the need for a research question. So other reports. So this is from the University of Pittsburgh. They have a Stern Center for Evidence-Based Policy that conducts they do like applied policy research analyses. This one provides a really good overview of the landscape of federal and state policies designed to address family caregiving. So if you're looking for sort of family medical leave acts or what current policies exist per state, this is a great reference to look at, including sort of a timeline over time. AARP also does a lot of other work here. This was a compilation of state data and analysis concerning long-term services and supports. The reason I like this one a lot is because they report a state-by-state scorecard, and that scorecard looks at 5 dimensions in particular. It's, let me think, it's long-term care, affordability and access, setting and provider choice, quality of life and quality of care, and then they have a support for family caregivers as one of the domains, and then effective transitions. So if you're looking to kind of do some sort of justification for why in your state, you might want to focus, this is a great one to look at what's actually available in your state and how they kind of rank compared to other states. This was a Merrill Lynch report, a survey of about 2,000 caregivers. It's really great because it provides a financial overview of caregiving and really tries to break down the out-of-pocket costs of caregiving and providing care in the home. And so for any of you interested in sort of the economics of caregiving and healthcare utilization from that perspective, this is a great resource. I know that a lot of us like to sort of promote aging in place and perhaps dying in the home, not in the hospital, not in the ICU. For a lot of people, that makes a lot of sense, but it's also that families are providing this care in the home, and they're often not only having to do all the tasks that we're now sort of delegating to them if they're doing this in the home, but they're also usually forking out the money to be able to provide this care. And so this is a really great report that provides an overview of that financial hardship for folks. Oh, let's see, other reports. So AARP partnered with this group called HitLab. They did a nationally representative survey of about over 1,000 caregivers. They also did qualitative interviews where they really tried to understand how caregivers are using technology, including computers, tablets, smartphones, wearable sensors, stuff like that. And they also did some qualitative interviews about barriers to technology use. So for any of you interested in caregivers and their use of technology, this is a really excellent report that really breaks it down by age group and by generation and their use of technology and what barriers they see to using different types of technologies. This same group also conducted a series of pilot studies where they tested various technologies. One was to assist with care coordination. Another was like a personal emergency response device. Another was a home care aid. It's like a hiring platform. This just gives you an overview of what a study, if you're piloting sort of a technology adoption type study, what that might look like. This is a report that outlines 4 of those going on now. This actually just came out this year. This was put out by the National Alliance of Caregiving. They held a summit to determine ways to involve family caregivers in medical product development. That might not sound that exciting, except that medical product was really interpreted pretty widely in this report, and it included things like advanced directives. And so they also talk about how things like respecting choices and 5 wishes, how one might include family caregiving in the design of these quote unquote medical products. So it's an interesting read and kind of gives you a flavor of how to involve caregivers if you're trying to sort of develop an intervention or some product related to palliative care. There is an International Association of Care Organizations. I'll talk a little bit more about the National Alliance for Caregiving. They're a member of this organization, and they have come together globally to kind of form a cohort of all these big organizations internationally. And if you kind of need, it's almost like the WHO of care support. So if you need sort of a global perspective on caregiving, this is a good report to kind of start with. And this is a good organization full of resources to help you think about family caregiving from a global perspective. Okay, systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So there are a lot of systematic reviews and meta-analyses out there in the world. The ones that I'm going to kind of show here are just have to do with sort of intervention sort of types of effects, but there are systematic reviews on every aspect of caregiving that you could possibly do. There's no way to do it real justice. In fact, I think there's now a systematic review of systematic reviews in caregiving that actually hasn't been published yet. It's about to come out. So that's to say there's a lot of reviews. I'm only presenting a small section. I'll take a little bit of a commercial break here. Abigail, you're asking, new to PCRC in these webinars, welcome. Where do we get a copy of these slides? I believe they will be provided afterwards. Or right. On the PCRC website.
They're on our website now, and we'll also have them there with the recording afterwards.
So this one was a 2011 Cochrane review by Barbara Gomes, looking at the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of home-based palliative care services it was a disease agnostic and it included caregiving. It's a really great one. It's very comprehensive. This is one that I did with a fantastic group where I stupidly tried to look at every single research study that had been done up to like 2016 in heart failure family caregiving. And I think we did a reasonable job of trying to highlight research directions for family caregivers of heart failure patients. This was one that Betty Farrell did. It was an update of one done by Laurel Nordhaus up to 2010, I think. And this one was 2011 to, I want to say 2015 or 2016, where they looked at all the interventions to date done in oncology family caregiving interventions. Again, an excellent review of that literature. Here is another Cochrane review. These are interventions supporting informal caregivers of patients in the terminal phase of disease. This includes some meta-analysis findings, which is great when you're trying to get an estimate of effect. If you're doing interventions and want to know like how big of an impact have we had in the past, this is a good resource to look at to try and see how well we've done up to this date. This was one that was done by Joan Griffin. In her group, it's mostly the dementia. It also includes cancer and other memory-related disorders, a systematic review of interventions in that space, very comprehensive, up to 2013. Here is one that's done by NHS in Great Britain, and it also includes just a whole catalog of interventions that have been done across disease types. And I believe they do this one every so often. So it's sort of a repeat every 5 years or so. If you're looking for papers to cite related to what are the research priorities, this was one by my colleague Erin Kent that is based off of an NCI summit that was held, also co-sponsored by NINR, where they were looking at caregiving priorities in cancer research. Other similar types of papers are this one by Richard Schultz in geriatric palliative care. And most recently, HPNA, led by Rafael Romo, published HPNA's 2019-2022 research agenda, and this also outlines priorities in family caregiving and palliative care, so a really great resource there. So, I mean, like I said, there's about 1 million reviews out there. This is just a very small selection. I do encourage you all, if you have specific areas that you're interested in, either reach out to Betty and I, and happy to kind of point you in the right direction of systematic reviews that are out there and that have been done, many of which have been done by people on this call. So, question 3, how should I define family caregiver for my study? Okay, some key points. These are usually relatives, parents, or close friends. I usually add the word unpaid in my eligibility criteria because I see paid and unpaid caregiving as different, albeit there's exceptions. People can actually get paid as a family member to provide care. It's kind of a minority of folks at the moment who provide some type of support. I will often approach patients in clinic, ask them if they have someone helping them, and they'll say, and their wife will be right there, and they'll say, no, I don't need any help. And their wife will say something to the effect of, no, I don't do anything for him. I'm not sure I always count them as sort of family caregivers. I do like to have them provide some type of support for them to fall under some definition of what I think of as a family caregiver, at least for my intervention trials, where we can actually have some sort of impact. Oh yes, caregivers do not like being called caregivers, nor do they like being called informal. So for most of my studies, I don't use the word caregiver at all, except like when I write grants or publish stuff. When I go out and write materials for interventions or recruit people, I always say family members or close friends. I never use the word caregiver. It can make, it's a hard word oftentimes for men to identify with, and it can sometimes make patients feel like they're sort of overly juvenile or dependent upon this person who is their caregiver. So it's probably not the best term to use, or it hasn't at least been for me when I've done research. The word formal is also puts a bad taste in people's mouth. And these are just like a couple of articles that I, kind of recently came across where they really disparage the term informal, that use of the word. Of course, that said, I have used it myself in my own studies before I was really recognized that this was not a term that was liked. So there you go. I think I was actually approached after I gave a presentation of this particular study by a family member who said, "Do I look informal to you?" So that wasn't fun. So I would caution against use of this term. Oh, yeah. So patients, yes. I often get asked, well, who are the patients they care for? Should we call them loved ones? Well, I would caution against that. The people they care for aren't always loved. I know that might sound insensitive, but some people won't identify with taking care of someone they consider a loved one per se. And here's an article from AARP where they have a little blog about caregivers who dislike loved ones that they're caring for. So I would also be cautious when using that term. I don't never use it, but I'm just very conscious when I do use it, especially for sort of recruitment materials and educational materials. It's just a term that I'm sensitive about. So there are many subpopulations of caregivers to consider, and they each have different characteristics and challenges. And I think I'd like to just kind of run through some of those subpopulations just to give you all a flavor of how many different types of caregivers that there are. I'll take a little pause here for a second. Catherine Ramos, you asked, for this last point, what term would you suggest of caring for someone who is not considered a loved one? I usually say if you're caring for someone who is close to you, who you may be related to, who's a family member, I often use relative. That's the term that those are sort of the language I typically use. So you're caring for a family member, you're caring for someone close to you, you're providing support to someone, providing unpaid support to someone who you're related to. That's the way I typically pitch it. And again, I don't never use that term. I just am very conscious of it. Not every caregiver is sort of in their role because they want to be. And then sometimes they often actually don't like the person that they're providing support to. So it's just something to be conscious of. So different populations. Sorry, let's scroll down here. Oh, so there's another question. There's an industry of professional caregivers. How do you think this has shaped the language of informal versus formal caregiving, and why there's real or perceived resistance to this terminology? There are, we are all professional caregivers because we get paid for it and we went to school for it. The language of informal, though, is disliked by people because they feel like they provide so much of this care. The word informal for them sort of means like, I just do this part-time, or I don't take it seriously. That's the connotation that's often associated with that use of that term. And so that's sort of what, if you Google that AARP article, that's what they'll talk about when they talk about people not liking that word informal. I think it's fine to call us formal caregivers. I just wouldn't call family members who are unpaid informal caregivers, if that makes sense. Okay, so different types of caregivers. There's the rural dweller. So like you're gonna see unique problems for these folks: transportation, housing during inpatient stays, difficulty navigating sort of an unfamiliar urban system. They'll have minimal local resources. They usually have poor employment support. And this can be really different than like the working family caregiver, which actually many caregivers are. This will be a lot of your millennial type generation. They have to work to maintain their health insurance. And so they're totally busy. They often have job-related distress. And in fact, a lot of working family caregivers report they don't have any job-related support. And just so everyone knows, the risk of decreased work productivity is a real thing, where they've kind of shown that your productivity can decrease by 20% when you're caring for someone more than 20 hours per week. So it just exemplifies how populations of different caregivers can be really different. There's the sandwich generation. They're juggling young children and older adults. They're trying to find childcare while they're performing caregiving duties. They're helping children cope. They'll ask, how should I explain this to my 8-year-old and my 4-year-old? And that's when I have to call up my pediatric palliative care peeps. They often have marital dissatisfaction because they're so busy. There's the African-American caregiver. I throw this one up there because I'm in the Deep South. They can be distrusting of the healthcare system. They can often report more unmet needs. They often provide more intense care, and they're also more likely to be a non-spouse. There's sort of the spousal caregiver, which probably makes up much of this population. They have this sort of marked shift in give and take in their daily relationship, and because of that, it can really cause a lot of marital dissatisfaction. And they often do a lot of this thing called protective buffering, where they will often put on, neither one of them will be fully transparent about what the experience is like for them. And so they'll just try and hide it behind sort of a brave face. And this is actually a huge predictor of distress and marital dissatisfaction. They're also at higher risk of anxiety and depression and higher task burden. There's also the LGBTQIA+ caregiver. They may have less help from blood relatives, so they'll have to turn to sort of a family of choice. They often have a fear of stigmatization by healthcare agencies, and there's often some greater diligence that's needed in documenting advance directives, wills, trusts, albeit it's gotten much more easy after the Defense of Marriage Act was passed. There's the parent caregiver of a child for my pediatric palliative care folks. They really struggle with being a good parent. That's a real identity crisis for this type of caregiver. It's highly stressful decision-making for a child. They can also be highly prone to protective buffering, both towards their spouse and towards the child, which often leads to marital dissatisfaction. And they're often really trying to help siblings cope. And how you help siblings cope for different ages can look quite different depending on their ages. And so this population of caregivers actually looks quite different whenever you're thinking about trying to support them or whenever you're studying them. So there's many subpopulations of caregivers to consider, and I would think about that when you're thinking about a study that you want to do with them. Second point, not all caregivers are distressed. And we've had a little bit of difficulty in sort of intervention clinical trials world about budging a needle, and some of it's due to the fact that we're not actually recruiting caregivers who might most benefit from our additional support. So you may want to think about screening for caregivers who are at higher distress or maybe have more unmet needs instead of just taking all comers. I often get the question, there are often patients who have multiple caregivers. You just have to think, are you going to roll them all or just one? It's just something to think about whenever you're doing a study is who if someone is receiving different types of family support, do you want to enroll? And I think I actually talk a little bit more about that question here in a bit. Okay, what's my theoretical or conceptual framework? I'm a nurse, so we're all crazy about conceptual models. I think a really great resource for this that you can Google is NCI's Theory at a Glance. I think it's 2003 or something like that. It's probably a little dated, but I think that it offers a really great overview of how you use conceptual models to develop interventions, behavioral interventions. And when I say theory or conceptual model, I'm talking about a systematic way of understanding events or situations. It has a set of concepts, definitions, and propositions that we base our hypotheses on. They help explain or predict what's happening over time and illustrating relationships between variables. I think it's really important to have one. So I'll briefly just kind of show you the one that I use a lot. It's called the Perlin Stress Process Model of Family Caregiving, and it's really based off of Lazarus and Folkman's stress appraisal model, so it might be familiar if you are a psychologist background. This might seem pretty familiar. And it all starts with sort of this background and context. This is your sociodemographics and sort of a history of care that or a history of the relationship that you've had with this person. And then you have primary stressors. So these are things like the person has cancer, or they have a lot of ADL needs, or they have treatment costs. And remember, and then there's a subjective stressor to those objective stressors, like maybe costs, maybe you're independently wealthy and that doesn't stress you at all. Great. Other people, it can cause, they react to it in a different way, and that can cause a lot of financial strain. And here, these are just subjective primary reactions to the objective stressors. Secondary stressors are like the spillover stuff. So now that I have to drive, my spouse to their chemotherapy infusions, I have to take time off work. So now I have job conflict. I have to take unpaid time off work. And so these are sort of the spillover things that happen. These are those secondary stressors. For families, this is additional family conflict. Like, I can't get my brother to come help. He's never around, even though he lives closer. These are the things that spill over and cause other additional sources of stress. There's also intrapsychic strains like self-esteem and sort of a loss of self that can happen. If I have to go part-time at work, I can completely lose my position or my role. And there's a lot of self-esteem threats that go on whenever a family member is trying to deal with the spillover effects of caring for someone with serious illness. And finally, these are the outcomes of caregivers' well-being. And one reason that we want caregivers to feel good, over and beyond that being a good thing in itself, is that we would think that a healthy caregiver is able to develop more high-quality care to patients. And so I like to throw in that link in there as well. And then here are the resources that people use to cope with, at each point in this process, either it's coping or resilience or social support that they're leveraging. And this is the model that I typically use. But there's so many. There's so many. I'll show you a few. There's a family systems illness model, where family functioning in an illness context is an outcome of interaction between the family's developmental stage, the illness over time, the family system structure. I've never used this one, but here's a reference. There's person environment fit models, and I'm going to kind of go a little faster, seeing the time, and just let you all read or look at the slides afterwards. There's biobehavioral models. They'll look at biobehavioral activity. So if you're interested in things like biomarkers, this might be a good model to use. Medical family therapy model. This is sort of a psychotherapy model where you're trying to increase empowerment and a sense of feeling supported by family members. This is one that I found in pediatrics. One of the assumptions was that the majority of families with a child with cancer are confident and highly organized. I have no idea if that's really true. So if you're a pediatric person and you're shaking your head right now, yeah, I agree, but that's what they said. So we can just yell at Wall et al. 2009. But that's the model that they propose here. There's an illness beliefs model where a family caregiver's experience of the illness itself existentially can have an effect on the actions they take to be a good caregiver. And the PCRC Caregiver Core, we have resources to help you with your theoretical or conceptual framework. If you go to our Schnazzy website and you look down the page of the Caregiving Core, you will see right here, you can select a conceptual model of caregiving research where we've listed a few for your viewing pleasure. So check out that if you need a model. Okay, what outcomes am I trying to examine? I think it's always good to think about what actually do you care about. So you might look at caregiver-focused outcomes. These might be health and well-being outcomes like quality of life, distress, burden, strain, mood, depression, anxiety, physical health, grief, bereavement. You might look at caregiving skills. So you might look at how well caregivers communicate or how prepared they are. How good are they at surrogate decision-making or partnering in decision-making? You might look at their knowledge. The Dunning-Kruger effect is my false belief that I'm better at something that I really am until I learn something about it, and then I realize how much I didn't know. That's why knowledge is often not my favorite thing to measure in caregivers, but it's there. And then you might measure sort of a nursing task like medication administration or their proficiency at doing wound care. There's also caregiver health utilization. You can look at how much they're spending out of pocket on the patient's care. You can look at their own primary care and wellness visits. You can look at a caregiver's own hospital days and ED visits because they are often not without their own chronic illnesses. You can look at their work time off and how much paid time off work that they're taking off. And you can also look at how much they're paying people to come help them. You can look at patient-focused outcomes. So I think these are all pretty familiar to us. You can also look at a big question right now that's actually a part of some of the FOAs that are out there are on what impact does supporting caregivers have on patient healthcare utilization. These are just, I think, a few that we tend to focus on in palliative care. There are others. And then we also often look at end-of-life outcomes like quality of life at end of life and medical intensity in the last 30 and 7 days, place of death, symptoms at end of life. All things that we tend to look at when we're looking at the caregiver's impact on patient-focused outcomes. We might look at relationship-focused outcomes. So this might be patient-family healthcare clinician relationships. You might look at the quality of communication and triadic medical encounters. You can look at satisfaction with care. You can kind of take a sort of a quality measures approach to it. Patient-family healthcare clinician concordance. We often look at does the provider's beliefs about what's going on or prognosis match with the patients, match with the family caregivers. You can look at caregiver and patient relationships. This might be relationship strain or marital satisfaction, intimacy. You can look at if they're having serious illness conversations. Oh, I guess I used that one twice. You can also look at caregiver health utilization. Okay. So what demographic data should I collect? And what instruments should I use? I'll just be straightforward with this one. These are the ones that Betty and I think you should collect. I will just list them out. Sorry. So these slides will be available. These are the things that I think, we typically recommend that people collect. If you want to collect less, then we can give you advice about, which ones to eliminate versus keep. If you have to look at wording for these actual items, I often refer people to how it's phrased in the National Alliance for Caregiving in the U.S. report. Number one, that survey has been vetted now 4 times nationally in terms of its wording and readability. And 2, it would give you a national benchmark to look at where your sample relates to sort of a population level assessment. So that's sort of the rationale for maybe using some of these demographic questions. What instruments should I use? So I just have general considerations. I'm not going to actually talk about instruments or specific ones. I would tell folks, look at what's been documented in systematic reviews of family caregiving. What have other similar studies used? If you're doing an analysis and it's pretty similar to something that you've read about or seen before, consider using that instrument. Oh my gosh, if you're not a psychometrician, please don't develop a new instrument. Developing an instrument can be really, really hard and harder than people think if they've never done it before. So please, unless you've had training in instrument development or have a psychometrician on your team, I wouldn't go there. Not to mention that it probably already exists an instrument. So the PCRC Caregiving Core, we do have an instrument library. Again, if you go to our site, it's here, the Family Caregiver Instruments and Assessment Tools. If you click on that, you'll see a very nice Excel spreadsheet with a long list of very searchable caregiving instruments. Here is the PCRC measurement core. There's also a measurement core. They also have a lovely set of instruments in their library, including systematic reviews of instruments. And so this is another great resource for folks to look at when you're searching for that instrument. So Brooke, you're asking, do you have a favorite social support measure, either for patients or caregivers? I do. If you email me on the side, I'll tell you about my most favorite one that I'm now using for the first time. I guess my first answer would be to look at promise measures of social support. They have informational, emotional, companionship. They have quite a few different types of social support measures on the NIH Promise website. I actually have another one that I kind of really like a lot that I'll talk about on the side. But I think if you want to just start with something that's been heavily vetted, I would look at those social support measures on the NIH Promise website. There are obviously some other caregiving relationship measures that you could use. Okay. What instruments should I use? Oh, this is a really great resource. So the Family Caregiver Alliance in 2012 did a huge sort of environmental survey of all the instruments that existed for family caregivers. And they list a ton. You can Google this and you can find it. There's a ton. So here's the table of contents, and I'm not gonna like read through all of these, but you can see that they have a lot of different domains, and underneath each domain, a whole ton of instruments that have been developed within that domain. There's a ton of them. Here's a bunch of well-being measures. I would encourage folks to look at that. If you actually went to the page that it's on, it tells you very brief, like Cronbach's Alpha, and a description of the actual instrument and the studies that it was tested in. It's pretty great. And it's a good resource just to at least get an initial sense of what's out there related to instruments specifically developed for family caregiving, including social support measures, if you really want to shop around. Okay, how can I recruit and retain family caregivers? Here's some considerations. How do I know if patients have one? How do I identify them? Okay, I'll tell you what I do. I ask the patient. You should prepare for some gatekeeping if you do that approach. Sometimes patients will say they don't want to further burden their family member with some survey or some intervention, so just prepare for that. But I often ask patients who their support person is. You can check emergency contacts in the medical record. Or, if the oncologist happens to write some really great notes about who accompanied them to their, oncology visits, that's also another great place to look for people who may have a caregiver. You can see if family are actually present during the healthcare encounter, and honestly, this is a pretty good proxy for me. If you are in need of enough assistance from family members, they're probably transporting you to your healthcare encounters, and so they're usually present during these encounters. Let's see, Betty, you asked, can you mention that the entire Family Caregiver Alliance list of instruments you just mentioned is on the PCRC website under core? Yes. So the entire, that National Alliance for Caregiving, backing up, this is on our core website, just for people. You can Google it or you can go to our website. Let's see, so be specific about what this person actually does for the patient, if anything. My new thing is to actually ask if this family member is actually doing anything for the patient. If they're not, then you may want to consider that they might not be a family caregiver, quote unquote, that you're really looking for or that you can do something with, simply because they might not be doing a whole lot. So you can ask about, do you think that you provide at least X number of hours per week of care, or are you involved in any way in this person's decision-making and advanced care planning? You might want to think about eligibility criteria in that way if you're recruiting for a very specific question. What if patients have more than one caregiver? Again, you can include any and everyone. If you do that, you need to probably consult with a statistician about nesting within patients, because you'll have some dependency in those data related to having it nested with under one patient. You can include the primary caregiver, or you could just you could get the person who's assuming a particular task. So like maybe this person has a spouse who does a whole ton, but maybe it's the daughter who manages all the finances, and that's what you actually care about. So you can also think about it in terms of which person in your family is doing which role, if you're thinking about more than one caregiver. You could also consider just including only distressed caregivers, or those who have unmet needs, or those who will actually stay in your trial and not drop out. Other key considerations, here's a bunch of papers. There's even more. These are just ones that I liked regarding recruitment. I would strongly suggest, and really this goes for patient research, strongly form relationships with clinicians, address their concerns. I always like to stress, at least in oncology and heart failure, like I'm not adding work to you. They're really concerned about that. So I would start your study with developing a good relationship with clinicians. What does this even mean? So opt out versus opt in. That means that if you hang a flyer in an elevator with like the little tear off telephone numbers, that's probably not going to be your best way. That's to say, I think it's better if you proactively approach people for your study instead of waiting for them to come to you. This is the same thing about relying on providers to send you caregivers. Good luck with that. I can't even get my wife to send me participants for my study. So it really is, I would say, dependent on you to go out and find them. Stress the why of your study and link it to the greater good. Like I always try and have our people recruiting for our studies really stress, like, why are we doing this study for the greater good, and like, why is their participation going to make a difference in the world? Acknowledge the emotions that they're having. They're in a stressful situation. They like that to be acknowledged because you're asking them to do, one more thing, even though we think it's going to help them. But I think it's really helpful and helps them buy into your study if you just treat them like a human being when you're recruiting them and acknowledge everything they're going through, acknowledge that it's stressful, appreciate them for that, because they often actually don't get appreciated at all. Be clear about what roles and what's involved in the study participation. I often have our team develop like an infographic of what activities are involved in the study. Many times I've noticed that people consent and then they actually forget what they even were supposed to do. So I would be very clear, when you first approach people about what exactly you're asking them to do. I would be very deliberate about how you introduce palliative care. For the general population, palliative care is hospice's end-of-life care. That's just that's the myth you got to break into. So I've actually used the term supportive care. I realize there's debate about these terms, but I use supportive care. It tends to be more acceptable to people, and it kind of sends a better indication of what we're trying to do for them anyway. I often do define palliative care, but it's not until later on when we kind of like developed a partnership and relationship and we've described what we're actually trying to do with our interventions. And they're like, oh yeah, that sounds great, palliative care. Never thought of it that way. How do I retain? Money, baby, you gotta pay them. I usually pay about $50 for questionnaire completion of 30 minutes. It may sound like a lot, but that's the going rate that I've typically heard when I've gone to different conferences and heard what the going rate is for paying participants. Be very flexible with your study activities. These people are often working, and so you need to work around that. Have supports in place for distressed caregivers. When possible, have the same project person work with them over the duration of the study. That really helps keep them in. They form a relationship with that person. I'm interested in interventions. I'm going to be really quick here because I want to have some time for questions. Just think, do I want to do caregiver focused, patient focused? Do I want to do a parallel intervention, or do I want to do dyadic, like couples? Do I want to do individual versus group format? Those are different. Do I want to do in-person versus telephone versus video conference versus like having them go on a website and do things independently? There's a bunch of different tactics you can do to try and change knowledge or skills or behaviors or attitudes. Here's a few. Please don't reinvent the wheel. There's been a lot of things that have been developed, including by people who are on this call. Here is a good source to go to. It's the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregiving. They have a caregiving intervention database where you can search a bunch of interventions that have been developed. It's not all comprehensive. I'm not sure actually how often they update it, but it really does allow you to kind of get an overview of stuff that's already out there. And here's the website. I'm going to skip through this slide. It's self-explanatory. You can read it on the slide set. Major organizations. So these are the big ones. Again, they're pretty self-explanatory if you just look at the slide set. I included a couple of pediatric palliative care ones down there at the lower right. And if there are any others in the pediatric palliative care world that you want to shout out, just put it on the message line there. These are all organizations that a huge part of their strategic direction is caregiver based. And so they're great resources to look for everything from materials to policy initiatives, all that stuff. Oh, here's a bunch of funding announcements. Again, I would just look at the slide set and you can see what's out there. A lot of these expire soon, just FYI, except for that last one, PAR 19321. That's a new one. I see Karen Kell was on the call, probably still is. She could tell you all about it. I think she wrote it. So that's a really good one. It mentions family caregiving in the community. And that's the newest one that I've seen come out. And I think I'm missing some on here, but anywho, this is a good selection of some of the FOAs that are currently out there for caregiving. Oh, and finally, how can the PCRC Caregiver Corps help me with my research? There's Captain Betty Farrell. She's the one that you probably really want to go to, and then there's me. Here are our responsibilities as our Corps. We're here to help you. We can discuss opportunities to include caregivers in your palliative care studies that are already going on. We can explore areas of science needed to advance understanding. We can tell you what areas are kind of hot. We can assist you with the selection of conceptual models, study designs, variables, instruments. We're happy to have a call about that. And we can also discuss opportunities for you to include qualitative data in your caregiving research. So I know that last part was kind of lightning fast. Sorry I had to rush there, but I know people probably have to jump off. But if people have questions, or Sarah, if you want to sort of moderate questions that folks might have.
Thank you so much, Nick. If there are any other questions, please do put them in the Q&A feature. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, but I would bet that Dr. Dionne-Odom would be willing to answer them via email if we don't have time today. I think you've covered everything that's popped up in the Q&A feature so far. But now's your chance. Okay, so Catherine Ramos wrote, what is one area that you believe is in the greatest need for caregiving research?
That's a really great question. My opinion, my 5 cents, is that the greatest need for caregiving right now is to figure out ways to implement it in pragmatic settings, which is to say we've actually done a lot of work to develop interventions and we're having a really hard time getting them implemented into actual practice. And there's a lot of reasons for that, from the way that our the way that our insurance system works. We're not incentivized to actually support caregivers. This is a huge question right now. How do we actually integrate some of these interventions into caregiving research? That's a huge area right now. Another huge area is demonstrating how supporting caregivers impacts patients' healthcare utilization. Another big area of research. And that's really important because if we can't demonstrate that there is some kind of cost benefit or cost neutrality in these programs, there's no way to justify their funding unless you just happen to be a filthy rich institution. So those are probably the biggest areas that I can think of off the top of my head.
Thank you. And since we're at the top of the hour, thank you everyone who's joined. Thank you to Nick for your presentation today. If all of our attendees do go to our website, we have 3 more webinars that are posted for the fall. We hope that you'll join us for some of our future topics. And we will also be sending an evaluation where we gather other topics that you might be interested to learn more about. So please take a minute to fill that out. Thank you to our host and to all of our attendees for joining. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, everybody.